You know, I was thinking about this the other day. Horsepower has to be the #1 most frequently spoken word among motorcyclists. Every bike review, every bike night, every forum post eventually lands in the same place. How much horsepower does it make? Horsepower has become the universal motorcycle currency. It's how so many riders assign value to their machines. Higher horsepower means a better bike, right? Or at least a smarter buy. Getting more power for your dollars spent makes sense to some degree, doesn't it? Unfortunately, like most things in life, it's just not that simple. Some of the most fun bikes on the market make less than 100 horsepower, while plenty, if not most bikes with 200 plus are miserable anywhere except for a racetrack or a West Texas highway. Two bikes can make identical power and feel like they came from completely different planets. So today, let's talk about why shopping for motorcycles based on horsepower is one of the biggest mistakes a rider can make. Let's get started. Before we start dissecting the clear correlation between horsepower shoppers and male genitalia size, we need to clearly define what horsepower actually is. Since many people espousing the importance of horsepower had to repeat the 7th grade, I think it's an important starting place. Horsepower is the measurement of how quickly an engine can do work. As for motorcycles, it's essentially a calculation derived from torque and engine speed. So as much as you 600 squids hate to admit it, torque does matter. The faster an engine can apply torque, the more horsepower it produces. That's why the screaming inline 4 that revs to 15,000 RPM can make 120 horsepower, despite producing abysmally low torque figures. That's because those teeny tiny little pistons are able to rev super fast, spin the engine up fast enough, and the horsepower is gonna climb right along with it. But because of this principle, there is a catch. Horsepower numbers on a spec sheet, product page, or your buddy's Instagram bio only represents peak output. And peak output only happens at a very specific engine speed. More often than not, somewhere near the top of the rev range. And unless you're riding on track, a vintage 2-stroke race replica, or you're just a general menace to society, you're not spending most of your time in the top 25% of the tachometer. It's just not possible. Because most of the time when you're out on the street, you're probably somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 RPM. So when the R6 Chad says his R6 makes 130 horsepower to the wheel thanks to his exhaust and his tune, what he really means is that it makes 130 horsepower for 2 seconds between 14 and 16,000 RPM. Judging a motorcycle solely by its peak horsepower number is like saying your wife could be crowned Miss America just because you used your workplace disability check to buy her a new set of bolt-ons. We can all agree there's a little bit more to it than that. The real issue with shopping by horsepower is that the number only tells you how much power exists, not where it lives or how easy it is to find. We're gonna stick with the R6 as our subject for now because it really is the classic example of a bike that makes nice power on paper, but can be a bit of a slog to live with in reality. Plus, I'll take any excuse to make a few jabs at the R6 stands. They really are a fragile little bunch, aren't they? I'll acknowledge it is a legendary machine. It's pretty sweet to give it the beans and watch that tack needle rev to the moon. But what the R6 guys won't admit is that below 9,000 RPM, the R6 is essentially making the power of an R3. The bike doesn't really come alive until you're well into the rev range. Now, if you're on a racetrack where that kind of behavior is both acceptable and necessary, it's fantastic. But it really sucks when you're going from stoplight to stoplight, commuting across town, or even riding on some fun local roads. Now, we'll contrast that with the Yamaha R9, the bike that disappointed every cognitively diminished 600 squid around the world. What do you mean it has a bigger engine but makes less horsepower? What the hell? Is this the future that liberals want? To those individuals, I would politely suggest referring back to the first portion of this video to learn how horsepower actually works. The R9 uses a 3-cylinder engine that redlines at just 10,500 RPM, produces far more torque across the entire rev range. So even though the engine makes less peak power, it's pretty much making more power everywhere else. That's why it feels punchy, responsive, and linear by comparison. and it's why even on a racetrack, when you're picking it up off the apex, it's gonna gap that R6. And this is exactly why middleweight twins have become so popular over the last 15 years as well. The SV650, the R7, the RS660, they're everywhere now. And yeah, they all make less peak horsepower than a traditional 600, but they make power where you actually use it. And in many cases, that makes them feel faster. And if not specifically faster, it definitely makes them more fun. Here's the thing too, the problem with shopping by horsepower doesn't stop with just the power band. Even if two motorcycles make identical horsepower, there are still other factors that completely change how they feel. One of the biggest ones is weight. Horsepower alone is meaningless unless you know how much motorcycle it has to move. That's why bikes built for racing programs are just as concerned with weight reduction as they are with outright power output. You've got to find that Goldilocks zone where a bike makes as much power as possible for a given weight bracket. Here's a real-world example. Many devout Ducatisti cried heresy when the last generation Panigale V2 was replaced with the current model. The outgoing bike had a 955cc V-twin making 155 ponies. The new bike uses an 890cc V-twin that makes about 120 horsepower. That's a massive loss of 35 horsepower. Total disaster, right? Until you also realize the new bike weighs 37 pounds less. Suddenly, that reduction in power becomes far less dramatic when it's paired with a significantly lighter motorcycle. But weight alone doesn't tell the whole story. There's also the matter of chassis design, which plays a massive role in how a bike actually performs. Frame stiffness, suspension components, and overall geometry influence how fast a motorcycle can feel. Look at the Kawasaki H2. Yes, it is insanely powerful, but it's also heavy and it uses a steel trellis frame instead of the aluminum twin spar design used by most modern superbikes. That means the H2 prioritizes strength and stability and top speed over ultimate agility. So pretty much anywhere except a straight line, the H2 will be challenged by motorcycles with far less horsepower. Because motorcycles don't go fast simply because they make big power numbers. They go fast because the entire machine works together as a system, and that's not even taking into consideration gearing. Gearing can massively change how a motorcycle feels as well. Internal gear ratios can massively change as well. Leader bikes often go 90 miles per hour in first gear, where a supermoto needs to slam through 6 different gears just to get there. It's not as simple as just outright horsepower. We have finally ended the streak of piddly middleweight sport bike giveaways on YamiNoob.co. 2026 is feeling different because I've got this fire-breathing 175 horsepower V4 motorcycle right here up for grabs on YamiNoob.co. Click the link down below and support the show. Become a member today for your best chance to win this machine and have it show up in your driveway. You're not going to want to miss it. This is one spicy meatball, and I hope it goes to one of you watching right now. Click the link and check it out. Now back to the show. And look, even if you ignore everything I've said in this video thus far, and you still go for that insane high horsepower motorcycle based on power figures alone, you're gonna find out something quick. You'll almost never use that power. As I mentioned earlier, in regular riding, you're probably hanging out somewhere in the middle of the rev range. You've got traffic, speed limits, self-driving ride-share cars, delivery robots, half-naked homeless people running up and down the streets. Well, that's just maybe an Austin, Texas thing, but still, there's a lot of stuff out there. Say you buy an S1000RR, a Panigale V4, or some busted-ass Gixxer Thou off of Facebook Marketplace. They all make 200 horsepower or more. Brutal! Epic! But on public roads, you're really just scratching the surface of what that bike can actually do. First gear alone can take you well past any reasonable speed limit. By the time you're getting close to peak horsepower, you're already deep into lose your license immediately territory. And unless you're one of those influencers living that life and you're just getting pulled over by cops every other day, that's probably not what you want. So if you've got a huge horsepower bike, it's probably going to spend most of its life operating at about 30% of its true potential. And look, that's kind of cool, right? Because then it means when you got an open stretch of highway, you can just let that thing eat. But that's just a small amount of time. And from just a value perspective, it raises a pretty obvious question. Why spend all that money on performance you never get to use? A middleweight bike making somewhere around 100 to 120 horsepower is often far more fun for an intermediate or an experienced rider most of the time. You can actually rev the engine out, use most of the power, and enjoy the motorcycle the way it was designed to be ridden. It's a painful irony. You buy a really high-power bike because you want all the power, and then you never really get to use it. It's sort of like being cucked by your own short-sighted decisions. Such a shame. And again, unless you really are about that life, then I suppose you could use the really big horsepower motorcycle most of the time. But be prepared for tickets and/or jail. Bubba likes them thick. So if horsepower is such a poor way to judge motorcycles, why has it become the dominant metric that riders obsess over? Well, we can probably blame the manufacturers for that. Manufacturers know that big numbers sell bikes. Horsepower is simple to understand. A bigger number equals a better bike. The specifics of frame geometry are complicated, suspension components are multifaceted, rebound, damping, spring rates. What is all this mysticism? Are buyers required to have an engineering MBA to understand why an RSV4 factory with semi-active Öhlins handles better than a Royal Enfield Meteor 350? Of course not. The Aprilia makes 220 horsepower. That's all you gotta know. Back in the early aughts, breaking 150 horsepower on a production sport bike was a big deal. Then the numbers crept towards 170, then 180, and once the 200 horsepower barrier was cracked, the floodgates opened. It's ironic because the more power these bikes make, the more safety features are required to make them even rideable. Modern bikes have advanced TC, slide control, wheelie control, cornering ABS, and ride modes that noticeably detune the engine. Manufacturers are building motorcycles that produce north of 200 horsepower and then simultaneously developing entire electronic ecosystems just to keep that power under control and probably only giving you like 150 at any given time. I mean, Ducati even limits it by gear. You can only get the 240 once you're in top gear. When bikes are developed for racing, that makes sense. Manufacturers want a strong homologation platform for series like World Superbike, but nobody's racing a Super Duke or an H2 or a Hayabusa for that matter. These bikes exist and make the power they do solely for the sake of maximalism, for the appeal of being the biggest, baddest, fastest, and just most ridiculous thing on the showroom floor. OEMs may have started the horsepower arms race, but riders are just as guilty for perpetuating it. Motorcycle culture has a weird obsession with spec sheet superiority. People compare horsepower numbers the same way alpha male TikTokers compare body counts, or the way elementary schoolers in the 2000s compared holographic Pokemon cards. But eventually, as riders age and earn valuable experience, they typically begin to move in the opposite direction. Because the more you ride, the more you realize that thinking so much about horsepower alone is a smooth-brained, small wiener move. Now, not to flex too much, but I've ridden over 200 different motorcycles, and once you ride that many, you stop caring so much about horsepower. Not completely, of course. I mean, you guys have seen me on the 210 V4. It is a ton of fun. We're all human at the end of the day. Power is fun. Nobody's pretending slow bikes are the pinnacle of the motorcycling experience. I certainly am not saying that. But you begin to realize that horsepower alone tells you almost nothing about how enjoyable a bike will actually be. It's really a balance of multiple characteristics. How does the bike feel? How eager is it to turn side to side? How predictable and linear is the throttle? How well does the chassis communicate with the rider? How usable is the power? Is it actually fun? Does it sound cool? Does it look nice? Does it make you happy? Are the gears nice and snappy? Does everything work well? All these factors may influence what makes a bike good far more than horsepower alone. That's why some of the most beloved motorcycles ever built have pretty modest horsepower numbers. The SV650 has been enjoyed by hundreds of thousands of riders over the last 25 years, and it makes 75 ponies. The Triumph Street Triple has established itself as a benchmark for the modern middleweight motorcycle, and it makes less than 130 horsepower. And while they're not necessarily to my personal taste, countless riders in the United States gravitate towards Harley-Davidson and other big V-twin cruisers. Now these bikes make pitiful horsepower by comparison to their displacement, but there has to be some merit to having well over 100 foot-pounds of torque, moving a 700-pound machine beneath you with authority. The spec sheet obsessed horsepower freaks are missing the bigger picture. Motorcycles are about the overall experience, something that can't be quantified by a single number. Just like your old lady at home, you gotta take the time to understand their complexities. Limiting your entire approach to horsepower alone is basically admitting you'll never understand women and settling for a hentai body pillow instead. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. I appreciate it. As always, I will catch you in the next one.